Angel Reese got traded, and Chicago barely reacted. No headlines exploding, no drawn-out debates, not even a hint of hesitation. Just a quiet morning, and a franchise deciding it was time to move on from one of the biggest names in women's basketball. We're talking about a two-time All-Star, a player who set rebounding records, a constant double-double threat suddenly gone. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because in today's WNBA, where the spotlight is locked onto Caitlin Clark, where every possession gets analyzed, every stat gets magnified, and every star becomes a headline, Chicago just made a move that completely breaks that pattern. While the rest of the league is chasing attention, highlights, and viral moments, the sky stepped in the opposite direction. So while social media is calling this the loss of a superstar, there's a different question worth asking. What if that's not what this was? What if this wasn't about giving up talent, but walking away from a perception? Because if Angel Reese truly was that kind of franchise player, this wouldn't have happened quietly. This would have sparked chaos, debate, and pushback. But none of that happened. And that silence? That's where the Real story begins. Because underneath everything, this comes down to numbers and consequences. Let's start with the numbers, because this is where most people get it wrong. At a glance, the stats look impressive. Double-doubles, all-star appearances, a rebounding record that might stand for years. If you're just scanning a box score, Angel Reese looks like exactly the type of player you build around. But once you go deeper, the picture starts to change. In 2024, she shot just 39% from the field. For a post player, someone operating almost entirely near the basket, not creating off the dribble, not taking tough perimeter shots, that number is a serious concern. We're talking about attempts mostly within 8 to 10 feet of the rim, and still only 39%. That's the kind of stat that sets off alarms across the league. In 2025, she improved slightly to around 42%. Supporters pointed to that as growth as progress. And yes, technically it is better. But 42% is still low enough that defenses don't have to adjust much, and they didn't. They knew exactly how to guard her. Then there's the three-point shooting, sitting around 18% across both seasons. Not 28%, not even low 20s, 18%. At that point, it's no longer just a weakness. It becomes something defenses can exploit. Opponents didn't need to respect her outside shot at all. They could sag off, pack the paint, and wait. And every team did exactly that. But here's the part that really shifts the entire narrative: the rebounding numbers. A significant portion of those rebounds came off her own missed shots. She'd get position, go up for a contested attempt, miss, and then grab the rebound. On paper, it counts. But what it doesn't show is the wasted possession, the broken flow, the reset that gives the defense time to recover. It's essentially using two possessions just to get back to the same spot. Over a full game and a full season, that adds up. Then there's the playmaking. There weren't consistent reads out of the post creating easy looks for teammates. No reliable pick-and-roll decisions opening things up. No real impact that made the game easier for others. What Chicago had was a player who needed more touches, more chances, more possessions, just to produce numbers that more efficient players create in one sequence. And over time, that started to affect the entire team. They weren't improving. They weren't evolving. They were slowly falling behind, even as the accolades kept coming. Now compare that to what was happening in Indiana at the same time. Caitlin Clark entered the league and immediately rewrote the record books, putting up historic numbers and leading her team back into playoff contention. But the real difference wasn't just stats, it was impact. Every player around Clark improved. Teammates elevated their game, found better shots, and played with more space and confidence. The entire system worked better because of how she ran the offense, drawing defenders, creating opportunities, and delivering the ball at the right moment. That's what true impact looks like. And when you compare that to what was happening in Chicago, the gap isn't small. It's massive. Now, even if you disagree with the on-court analysis, even if you believe the numbers don't tell the full story, the off-court timeline makes this move almost unavoidable. Because the issues didn't exist separately, they built on each other over time, creating a situation that became too difficult to manage. Early in the 2025 season, before things had even settled, Angel Reese publicly raised concerns about discrimination during a game. The league investigated thoroughly and found no evidence to support the claim. That moment set a tone. Instead of letting things play out on the court, the situation escalated publicly and brought added attention to the team. From there, the pressure only grew. Then came the situation involving Courtney Vandersloot. While she was recovering from a serious injury and working her way back, Reese made public comments questioning whether the team could rely on her moving forward, pointing to age and suggesting the need for younger options. And this wasn't just any player. This was a respected veteran, a champion, someone who chose to be part of Chicago's future. When those comments went public, it didn't just create tension, it sent a message across the locker room. At that point, it wasn't just about performance anymore. It became about trust. And once that starts to break, everything else follows. At a certain point, if you stopped being valuable to Angel Reese, you didn't hear it behind closed doors. You heard it through the media. And that kind of realization doesn't just stay in a press conference. It follows you into practice, into film sessions, into every quiet moment where trust is either built or slowly torn apart. Kamilla Cardoso was right there in the middle of it, her front court partner. The same player Chicago is now clearly building its future around. They shared the paint every night, worked off each other, relied on each other's positioning. And yet, at some point during the season, Cardoso reportedly reached her limit and walked out. Not a trade request, not a private meeting, a full walkout. Think about what it takes for that to happen. The player setting screens for you, boxing out so you can grab rebounds, adjusting her positioning based on yours. When that kind of connection breaks to the point where one player would rather leave entirely, that's not something you fix with a team meeting or a conversation. That kind of damage sticks. And from Chicago's perspective, the direction became clear. If they were going to build around Cardoso, and everything suggests they were, keeping both players in the same environment just wasn't realistic. Then came the September 2025 interview. Reese openly said the team needed better players, that they had to stop settling for what they were putting on the floor. On the surface, it might sound like accountability, like someone demanding higher standards. But context matters. Those comments weren't made after leaving the team. They weren't internal. They were public and directed at teammates she was still playing alongside. Teammates who would read those quotes, whose families would see them, and players across the league would take note of what it's like to share a locker room with her. That's not leadership. That's not raising the bar. That's tearing down your own environment while you're still inside it. Eventually, Chicago responded. She was suspended for conduct detrimental to the team. And that kind of suspension doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not about one bad moment or one interview that went too far. It's what happens after months of internal conversations, after repeated attempts to address issues privately, after the front office and coaching staff try everything behind the scenes and nothing sticks. At that point, putting it on record becomes the only option left. That suspension wasn't just a punishment. It became documentation, proof that the organization had reached its limit. And once that existed, the trade wasn't a question of if anymore. It became when, and what can we get in return? So then the focus shifts to Atlanta. The Dream framed the move like they had just added a key piece to a championship puzzle. A dynamic player, a perfect fit for their culture. The kind of language that sounds convincing until you actually look at the roster. Atlanta already had a frontcourt anchored by Brianna Jones and Brittany Griner. Both established players. Both operating primarily in the paint. Both needing touches around the rim. Now you add Reese into that mix, another player who works almost exclusively in that same space and doesn't stretch the floor. Suddenly, you've got three players competing for the exact same area on the court. And for any opposing defense, the solution is simple. Pack the paint. Take away driving lanes. Sit back and dare Atlanta to shoot from outside. The problem is that lineup isn't built to punish you from out there. And it doesn't stop there. Alisha Gray finished near the top of MVP voting. Ryan Howard had an all-star level season. Both are elite perimeter players, and their success was built on space, movement, open lanes, clean looks. Now compress that space by crowding the interior with non-shooters, and everything changes. The environment that allowed them to thrive starts to disappear. Their effectiveness isn't isolated. It depends on spacing. Take that away, and you take away a major part of what makes them dangerous. That's why even Atlanta's own fan base has been divided on this move. The people who watch this team closely understand what made it work, and they can see how this changes that balance. And beyond the X's and O's, there's the cultural side of it. Atlanta saw everything that happened in Chicago. The suspension, the public comments about teammates, the unproven allegations, the reported locker room tension, the walkout. And their conclusion was that a new setting would solve it. That a different city, a different group, a fresh start would lead to a different outcome. But history in professional sports tells a different story. Situations don't magically reset when a player changes teams. Habits, patterns, behavior, they tend to follow. Meanwhile, Atlanta had something solid building. Real chemistry. A clear identity centered around Gray and Howard. Now they're bringing in a player whose last official designation from her previous team, on record, was conduct detrimental to the team. That label doesn't disappear just because the jersey changes. Now flip it back to Chicago. Strip away the noise. Ignore the headlines, the debates, the social media reactions. What you're left with is a much simpler reality. Chicago didn't lose this trade. They won something that doesn't show up in stats or trade grades. They got their locker room back. Think about everything they were dealing with on a daily basis. Situations that had nothing to do with basketball, yet demanded constant attention. Internal issues, public controversies, tension between players, time and energy that should have gone into development and strategy being spent on damage control. Now, all of that is gone. The front office can focus on building. The coaching staff can run practices without underlying tension. The locker room breathes differently. And that's not a small thing. That's the foundation of everything. And the foundation they're building on now is Kamilla Cardoso, a young center with real upside, strong footwork, natural touch around the rim, defensive instincts that impact both ends of the floor, a skill set that fits cleanly into modern systems instead of working against them. More importantly, she creates opportunities within the flow of the offense, rather than needing extra possessions to generate output. She was also the player who reached her breaking point and walked away, which tells you everything about why keeping both players was never a long-term option. When you look at it honestly, the choice between them wasn't that complicated. Now about the return Chicago received, late first-round picks, and a future swap. The internet called it a steal for Atlanta, but that reaction misses one key detail. When a true franchise cornerstone becomes available, the entire league responds immediately. Teams call. Offers come in fast. Real assets get put on the table. Proven players, high-value picks, young talent with upside. That didn't happen here. Chicago made Reese available, and the rest of the league stayed quiet. Every team evaluated the full picture, the numbers, the fit, the locker room history, the suspension, and chose not to engage. No bidding war. No competing offers. Just Atlanta and silence. And that silence might be the most honest evaluation of all. Chicago didn't get outplayed in this deal. They got exactly what they needed, quickly. And just like that, they move forward. No drama. No drawn-out exit. Just a decision to close the chapter. Because this was never just about stats or highlight plays. It was about cost, the kind that doesn't show up in a box score. Now Chicago resets. New space. New roles. A new direction. In Atlanta, the gamble begins. A belief that what didn't work in one place can be rebuilt in another. And across the league, things keep shifting. New stars rising. Teams evolving. The balance of power quietly changing.